Embodying knowledge for a better tomorrow. And I'll let him introduce and take it from here. Amal Jacobson.
Thank you very much. First, I just really want to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me to this ridiculously gorgeous location to be able to share some of all of this with you. Is this mic working? Yeah. Okay. Have it close to me like that?
Yeah.
Right, so this is a Neohumanist education conference, but this is I have to be eating this thing. This is a Neohumanist education conference, but Neohumanism itself is a little bit of a tricky concept because unlike most philosophies, it's not just a kind of theoretical idea. Built into the whole concept of Neohumanism is how do you practice this? How do you embody this? Which is why it allies itself so naturally to something like an educational movement, but there's still some things that have to be parceled out there, because if we seek to really educate children in a so-called Neohumanist way, then it really forces us to ask ourselves, what does it mean to become a Neohumanist? What does it mean to try to embody some of these values so that hopefully we can pass some of these along to children? Excuse me. Okay. So would you mind going to the next slide? Yeah. So what it really gets into, essentially, at its core, is identity. Neohumanism is about reimagining what does it mean to be a human being. Who are you? Who do you think you are? And I chose this image just because I thought it was a little bit funny. It kind of reminds me a little bit what meditation is a little bit like. But when you ask somebody, who do you think you are? It's going to start with these kind of superficial answers. If you say, Amal, who are you? I'm going to say, my name is Amal. That's, the most essential thing that distinguishes me from others. I am a man, right? I'm 34 years old. I'm an American, and so on and so forth. But what do these identifiers really say about me? Do they exclude me from other people? Are they all to who I really am? And these are the kinds of questions that Neohumanism really opens up. Because, I'm sorry, I'm getting very distracted with this mic. You're right. I would probably prefer to do it that way. Can you hear me in the back?
Yeah.
Okay. A little louder. Excuse me. So, Neohumanism is a project in which you're trying to reimagine what does it mean to be a human being. Because I think most of the movements that are in the culture right now are I would say the opposite of what I'm describing here. I would say that various cultural forces, be they political or economic or any advertisement or commercial that you're going to be exposed to on your iPhone or social media, is going to be about division. It's going to be about how is your identity distinct from other people's, and how does that make you separate from them? And this especially gets complicated when you're talking about the fact that, for example, as part of my identity, right, is that I am a Mexican-American, which means that I've had a very different experience growing up than other Americans, right? And depending on what sociocultural or economic background you come from, that's going to really color the experience that you've had growing up in the world. And so, on the one hand, there is a lot about identity that seeks to divide you, but then, for example, why do I identify as a Mexican-American? It's mainly because growing up in the United States of America, not all, but some people never let me forget that I wasn't white. That was something that was thrust upon me, not something that came intrinsically from my soul, if that makes sense. And so these are really complicated issues regarding identity, and they require some sensitivity. Because how is it that we can celebrate and protect our human diversity while seeking to transcend divisions so that we can socially cohere into something deeper, something that is a little bit truer to who we really are on the inside rather than how we project ourselves in the world on the outside. Okay? So, would you mind going to the next slide? So it all starts with you. There's this sense of identity. And you don't think about it very often, but it extends out through your body to your clothes to even your fashion accessories. You know, like your foot, for example. If for some reason you were to get into some sort of horrible accident and you were to lose your foot, you would still be you. But unless and until you lose that foot, you would say, that's my foot. It's a part of me. Your sense of self extends out to the foot. Does that make sense? And so, as you are navigating through the world, unconsciously, your sense of self extends beyond just yourself. So the next step, if you could just move to the next slide, is it naturally extends out to the family. You have a sense of identification with your family. And that's a good thing. I mean, there's probably nothing more precious in the world than the relationship you have with your family. So then, the question is, what's wrong with that? There's nothing wrong with your sense of self extending as far as your family. But then let me put it to you another way. What if you meet somebody and you want to engage them in some sort of larger movement, I'm part of this Neohumanist education movement, we're trying to spread these real universal values around the world, and you get an answer something like, I'm just here to take care of me and my own. Have you heard of that in this in this part of the world, me and my own? It means me and my family. So there's nothing wrong with the identification of yourself with your family. But if it stops there, that's the problem. The problem isn't so much the love that you have. The problem isn't so much the identity. The problem is, where is the boundary of your love? Where is the boundary of your identity? And if it stops at any particular point, any point at all, then you're part of this new humanist project. It's not over. And the beauty of that, and the difficulty of that, is that it's never over. New humanism is a project that requires a lifetime of practice. It's never really over. Because, as much as I try to tell myself, I'm this, I'm that, and the other thing, I'm a new humanist, right? That's as some sort of identifier. I've studied this my entire life. I'm a teacher in a humanist school. I've been meditating for X amount of years, right? I'm still so identified with very narrow ideas regarding who I am. I'm very narrowly identified to my nationality. I'm very narrowly identified, with my cisgender status, or whatever you want to call it. Right? And it's not so much that makes me some sort of bad new humanist, but the key is being conscious of where my limitations are and consciously trying to push them, pushing that envelope, trying to go deeper. Who am I really? Is this all who I am? Can I go deeper than that? Like, for example, my name's Amal. I'm an American. Does my identity go deeper than being American? I would say so, otherwise I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be able to engage with all of you. I'm a man. Does my identity go deeper than that? I'm a straight man. I would say that my identity goes much deeper than my sexual orientation, much deeper than my gender. Otherwise I wouldn't be able to have such meaningful relationships with people whose lifestyles and whose genders are very different from mine. But then how much deeper can we go? I am a human being. Is that all I am? Is that all I am really? Does my identity go deeper than that? These are the kinds of questions that new humanism demands of us. So let's move on, if that's okay. Thank you. So P.R. Sarkar, who is the propounder of new humanism, he really delineates two essential sentiments, which are kind of the ways in which our human emotion and love and identity expand beyond ourselves. And the first one he delineates is geosentiment. So, geosentiment has to do with your innate and very natural attachment to the land that you grew up on. Okay? So geosentiment it's pretty natural, I would say, for most of us to have an attachment to our homeland, to where we grew up. You know, I do have a certain pride as a New Yorker. You know, even in the United States, wherever I go, you know, I can't wait to tell people that I'm a New Yorker, mainly because it bothers them. One of these really amazing ironies that I've learned traveling around the United States, because in the United States, New Yorkers are renowned for their rudeness, right? And so I'll go to some place like Kansas, and this has happened. You know, and I'll be like, oh, I love it here, it's so beautiful, I just went biking in the Flint Hills, and they're happy, they're like, oh, that's nice, where are you from? And I said, oh, I'm New York, and they're like, oh, I'm New York, I hear you're all really rude. Yeah, exactly, for some reason, it's okay, you know, where I come from is the only place in the world where it's okay to be like, oh, your place sucks. But I do carry a certain amount of attachment regarding that. I think it's a big part of who I am. It's a part of my identity. It's informed my consciousness. And I like that. And there's nothing wrong with that in Neohumanism. Again, the problem isn't so much that you have an identity that extends out and includes things like your family, like your gender or your sexual orientation or your homeland. The problem is, where does it stop? Does it stop? You know? There are many situations in the world that I don't have to go too deeply into because they're kind of these powder kegs in which if you look at the root cause, it's because you have 2 or 3 or 4 groups that are completely guided by this geosentiment. Okay? It's all about, this is my land. I'm entitled to this land. This land was promised to me. This was the land of my ancestors. And so on and so forth. And then that will hook up with religious identity, it'll hook up with cultural and ethnic identity, racial history, you name it. And so, if we could just move on. The next one, which is much subtler, is socio-sentiment. Okay, socio-sentiment is your identity extends out beyond yourself, beyond your family, beyond the place that you grew up, and eventually connects with a social identity, right? This is where it gets a little bit tricky. So I'm going to bring up a controversial example, okay? Where I think most of the people in the room are familiar with what's happening on the American-Mexican border right now, right? And regardless what your feelings are about immigration policy, which I don't need to get into here, there is a lot of moral horror that's being brought up, seeing the conditions in which these refugees are being housed right now. You know, the reports that are coming out of there are pretty horrible. The United States government just did an Inspector General report that basically called the situation on the border a human rights crisis. And it's extraordinary. But I turned on the TV and I saw a clip, and there was a newscaster who said, regardless of how they're being treated there at the border, it's not our children who are being locked up here. And I asked this question, who's we? Who is our? Who are our children? And this is where you begin to see the shadow of socio-sentiment kind of rear its ugly head. If my sense of self is so narrow that it only extends to my Americanness, then a child that is separated from her mother, who maybe doesn't have the medication that she needs. I mean, there's reports of epileptics who aren't getting their medication, of women being told to drink out of toilets, so on and so forth. Yeah. If my sense of self only extends that far, then I'm going to very easily rationalize everything that I see. Because not only is my identity associated with my Americanness, but in this case, almost certainly that person's identity is associated exclusively with their political party. Their political party is their tribe, it's their team, and it doesn't matter what their team is doing, they're against the other team, and the other team is bad, they're evil, and therefore you oppose anything that they do. And in politics, I'm sure, in every other country in the world, not just the United States, all the partisan parties tends to have this mentality. it's extremely narrow. And when you look at what is the motivating force behind them, it very, very, very rarely is any sort of universal sense of welfare. Okay? And socio-sentiment is not just about your nationality. It has a lot to do with your religious identity, with your racial identity, with your ethnic heredity. All of these things will color the ways in which you see the world. And none of these things are intrinsically bad. I want to reiterate that again. What Neohumanism teaches us isn't so much that you are wrong to associate yourself with your Danishness or your Swedishness. You know, the problem is if your identity stops there, if it excludes everybody who is not inside your tribe, then this is where the trouble begins. And it's a very, 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 just totally pervasive problem, I would say, in the culture of the world right now. But if you look at what's happening in the world right now, it's not like this is no problem, right? But if you look at what's going on right here, politics and this sort of intertribal stuff is just the beginning. Because the overarching problem that's kind of containing everything else right now is this unbelievable ecological crisis that we have on our hands. We're facing a real critical juncture, I would say, in the history of humanity. Because for the first time in human history, human beings have run up against the natural limits of what this planet is willing to handle, or capable of handling, I should say. So if you could just move to the next slide. Thank you. And I would say that this has a lot to do with the same problems. The way that we are looking even at the problems of climate change and ecological collapse, if you talk to ecologists, they don't even call it climate change anymore. They call it environmental or ecological collapse, because that's what they say is going to be faced. They say the idea that we're going to fix this is a delusion. It's not so much about how do we fight climate change. That time's already passed. The real question is now, how do we save as many lives as possible? You know, how do we mitigate this disaster as much as possible? How do we contain this damage as much as possible? Because it's just going to get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. The planet that your children is going to inherit, at least in terms of its ecology, will be significantly worse, significantly degraded compared to the planet that you inherited. And that's extremely heartbreaking. But look at the way that we're even thinking about this problem. They were talking about this recently at Harvard University, okay? How do we fight climate change? And the main solution that they're pushing right now, and I swear to God, I'm not making this up, you can look this up, is they are thinking of putting some sort of iron sulfide in the ionosphere so they can dim the sun. They would rather fight the sun than fight the defects of capitalism. Okay, this is the worldview. It's so entrenched that that seems easier. It seems easier to just dim the sun than to change anything about the way in which we are operating on this planet here. And I don't want, last time I gave a workshop, I mentioned this and people kind of freaked out. This is not some imminent thing that's happening. You don't need to organize yourselves. I'm using it as an example of the kind of backwardness of the worldview. And this backwardness is what I would call anthropocentrism, which is a very fancy word for the worldview is completely human-centric. Okay? Completely human-centric. And this is where we run up against, you know, humanism in general. You know, humanism has been around since the Renaissance. It first was a big deal in Christian thought, and now it's mainly in secular thought, secular humanism, and so on and so forth. It's one of the motivating ideologies behind the United Nations, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But it remains, and has always been, completely centered on the needs of the human. The Earth is basically a stage upon which human beings do things. And even the ways in which we talk about how we behave on this planet are kind of amazing. We don't utilize resources for the good of all. We exploit them. That's the way that we talk about it. We exploit those natural resources. You see? And so there's kind of an attitude right now, no matter what the political affiliation is, that the way to solve the problem is technocratically. So what I mean by that, dimming the sun is a perfect example of a technocratic solution. Okay? We're going to science our way out of this thing. Okay? And it's not that I'm anti-science, it's not that I'm anti-technology, I don't want you to get that impression. But if our solution starts from the same worldview that created the problem in the first place, then it's not going to lead, in my opinion, to a very different solution. Okay? This is not something that we can technocratically manage. In my opinion, in order to really engage with the challenges, not only of the environment and the ecology, but of our politics, of the polarization we see happening in society right now, in which people feel like if you don't feel the same way as I do politically, that makes you a bad person and I can't be Facebook friends with you because you're not woke enough, then we have to, I think that we really have to shift our consciousness and develop a new worldview. That is easier said than done. And that's where New Humanism really, to me, shows off its uniqueness. Because it's not just about extending your sense of self so that you recognize that it's only extended so far. That's part one, right? But then when you ask yourself, how deep do I really go? Who am I really? I asked that question before. You are a human being. Does your identity go deeper than that? And New Humanism doesn't shy away from a question like that. And a question like that, I would say, is intrinsically, it's a spiritual question. And this is, I think, one of the trickiest dimensions of how to talk about New Humanism. But I really, really, truly believe one of the most, not one of those, the most essential dimension of New Humanism in general. This is fundamentally, at its base, a spiritual project. But I want to be really clear by what I mean by that. I don't mean it's a religious project. Okay? I don't mean that it's bound by any ideas that you may or may not have about God or the divine, your belief in that or lack thereof. To me, that's irrelevant. It really is. Because if you go deep inside yourself and you ask yourself, who am I? And you can go into a part of yourself that is so deep, so intrinsic to who you are, that allows you to form a relationship with your pets, with your dog, with your cat, with animals, with the land around you, with nature, with the breeze, with the fragrance in the air. If you can go into that part of yourself, when you really try to open yourself up to it, is limitless. And that limitless part of yourself, what can you call it, if not spiritual? And that's mainly what I'm talking about here. Tapping into a part of your identity that goes so deep into the ground of your being that you recognize that it's the ground of every being. It's universal. Until you recognize a universal affinity for everything around you. You see things that are happening, for example, at the border crisis that I was talking about before. There are many problems to this. There's political problems, there's problems of policy, but if there's one problem that I see as the most essential, at the absolute rudiment of it, is that the people who are creating and enforcing these policies do not recognize themselves in the people that they are doing this to. They don't see themselves in the child and the mother that are screaming and crying and requiring help and care. They've got so much political ideology plastered on top that they're blocking themselves off from that part of themselves. They say, that person is different than me. And the proof that they're different than me is, and then they'll come up with some rationalization. They broke laws that they shouldn't have broken, and so on and so forth. But if you recognized yourself in the child, you would recognize not only is that my child, but that child is me. That child is me. That's the New Humanist way of looking at this. recognizing yourself in the other, recognizing others within yourself. Recognizing that the world around you is a kind of mirror, and recognizing that your impact goes much deeper than you might realize. And that's a spiritual project. If you can move on, thank you. And so that's why I say that spirituality and devotion are what I would call the engine of Neohumanism. So Neohumanism, I started off by talking about how Neohumanism is more than just a philosophy. This is part of what I mean. Because if you're able to recognize a dimension of yourself that I'm calling spiritual, if the word spiritual bothers you, pick another word. Doesn't matter to me, right? But if you recognize that there's a dimension of yourself that goes deeper than these sorts of very superficial boundaries, right? Then it's about tapping into that part of yourself and allowing that to be the engine for what I would call a heart-centered practice. At the core of what it means to be a new humanist is about tapping into this devotional part of yourself. Because if you come to help others, not from a place of politics or ethnic or national identity, but from a place in which you fundamentally recognize yourself in the other. And I think most of us already do this unconsciously in situations all the time. Anytime you come from that part of yourself, that deepest part of yourself, the action that you are offering, it's devotional. It's a devotional action. And that devotion is something sustainable. The reason why I consider that important is because most philosophies, if you look at the gap between theory and practice, right, there's a tremendous one. And part of the reason why there's just this tremendous gap is because there's a fundamental difficulty in embodying the ideas. How do you make them real? Okay? And so, for example, if you read the book that P.R. Sarkar wrote, in which he invented humanism, the liberation of intellect, he first analyzes humanism in general, right? And he says, what's the problem here? And if you talk to a lot of new humanists, they'll tell you something like, well, the humanism doesn't extend so far as to include plants and animals. Sure, but that's not actually what he cites as the main problem. The main problem that he cites is that these philosophies, like humanism, are devoid of what he calls a perennial source of inspiration. So, perennial source of inspiration. What does that mean? What that means is that a philosophy is nice in theory, but if you look at the way you then adopt it, it's mainly kind of just, it's almost like a fashion accessory. It's aesthetic. It's like, I'm a meditator, and that makes me different than you. I'm a vegetarian, which makes me better than you. I'm a this, which, I'm a that, I'm a this, it makes me superior, okay? Whatever it is. This is not that, okay? This is, because if you look at, for example, what happens in the United Nations, maybe the philosophy underlying everything is a kind of humanism, but in practice what you see is it degrades into a kind of internationalism, in which every country has their interests, and they're going to compete with each other very cynically, for the most part, to see whose interests win out, and it usually has to do with how powerful the country was in the first place and how much they can leverage that power, okay? It kind of degrades. No matter what the philosophical inspiration or impetus was, eventually it becomes an idea only. And so any philosophy, if you're going to embody it, requires a perennial source of inspiration. It requires something that allows you to push through difficulties. Not just push through, but lift you up through difficulties. So if you could just go to the next slide, please. So this is a quote from The Liberation of Intellect. The philosophy that is not motivated by any perennial source of inspiration is bound to become a formality only, which is exactly what I was talking about. Devoid of real sincerity. It may die out at any moment like a river which ends in the sands of the desert. So it must be motivated by a constant and perennial source of inspiration, which I call Neohumanism. When this Neohumanism operates in the external world, then internal devotion as a principle is transformed into devotion as a mission. So I want to talk about this. Internal devotion as a principle. Okay, so that part of yourself that feels this longing to help others when you recognize yourself in the other, when you recognize that the distinction between the self and the other is fundamentally a kind of dualistic illusion, right? when you recognize that devotion and you enact it in the world and you practice it and you keep going, then it's not just devotion as an internal principle. It's not just new humanism as a philosophy. It is devotion as a mission in life. Something that guides your every step. And none of us are going to be perfect at that. But what I've found is that the more you walk the walk, the more you begin to feel it from the bones inside out. And again, that doesn't make me or anybody else in this room perfect or better than anyone else. What it means is that we're living out the project of a lifetime. So if you just go to the next slide, please. So to return to that essential question, what is Neohumanism? It starts out as a philosophy, but then you recognize that that philosophy demands a practice. And that practice could be anything that you hook into. For me, it's essential that I meditate. You know, it's such a bedrock part of how I practice this. But I recognize that that's not necessarily going to be the case for everybody, and that's okay. Next. Then, if you're able to practice it, then you realize that it's not just a philosophy. It begins to inform your worldview. It becomes impossible for me to look at any situation that's happening in the world, be it political or whatever, without seeing it through these lenses, without seeing it through the lens of understanding what is happening here. How narrow is this sense of identity that it excludes so many. And eventually, the more you practice that, it's not just a worldview, it becomes a mission. And that can be overwhelming sometimes. You know, you read a lot in, for example, activist communities about self-care, because there's this huge problem, right, of burnout. And I think that this addresses this problem really beautifully, because it's not so much about putting yourself out there because you've got some sort of savior or martyr complex, you know, so that you can save the world. It's not about that. It's not about becoming the next Messiah. It's about sinking deep into who you really are. That's what it's about. It's about becoming more fully who you are destined to be. It's about following the allurement intrinsic in your psychology already, so that you're able to fulfill who you really are in deeper and more impactful ways the more you go on through life. And that becomes more of an unfolding than it becomes some kind of, nailing to the cross. And when you look at the divisions that are happening in society, it can all seem very, very intractable. It can feel a little bit like a quagmire. It can feel hopeless. I have difficulty, for example, teaching climate change to children, as my co-teacher will know, because it's very difficult to talk about the problem without it kind of miring itself in a total hopelessness that terrifies children, which is my fault, I would say, more than anything else. But when I feel like I'm really teaching the ideas as I intend to, what it's really about is a kind of invitation, almost from life or the cosmos itself, to deepen yourself into who you really are, so that you can fulfill some project that nobody else can do. Nobody else can do what you can do. You might have an identity that runs so deep that it connects you to everyone, but fundamentally, this universal identity, it's playing itself out through you. It's almost, you're almost the universe coming to know itself through your form. And therefore, what you have to offer is unique. It's different from what anybody else can do, what anybody else can offer. And that's incredibly special. New humanist education, to me, is so intrinsically linked with this. To try to give the child a notion that they can do something, that they can offer something to the world that's special. Not just because they, and when I mean special, I don't mean, they didn't do anything and let's give them a participation trophy. What I mean by special is that the more they apply themselves, the more disciplined they become, the more integrity they're able to develop, the more they're going to be able to hook into something that nobody else has. And once they can hook into that, it's about offering it back to the world. Because, you know, honestly, this world has enough intelligent, educated people, and they're doing terrible things. Okay? They're destroying this planet. They've already practically destroyed this planet. I don't care to educate more people, to be more intelligent, so they can design the next bomb. Okay? What I care about is developing real human beings. People who are more than ever dedicated to the project of what it means to be a human being. And to me, that's what New Humanism is all about. And if you really analyze it at the core, this is an incredibly simple idea. If you really analyze what it's really about, it's really just about love. To build something on the basis of New Humanism means to build something on the basis of real love for humanity. It is not possible to build a genuine society, one which is truly dedicated to collective welfare, if its most intelligent and active members constantly evaluate their contribution to society in terms of profit and loss. In a healthy society, where the only binding ingredient is genuine love, how will it be possible for coercion or legal compulsion to manifest this love, the true expression of society? In other words, this is not something that can come from the top down only. It comes from the bottom up. It comes from every person who's out there in the wilderness trying to teach these ideas to children, who's trying to embody these ideas for themselves. It starts from the grassroots up. So, thank you very much. Up. I don't want to go into her time, but we've got a couple minutes here for any questions if anyone's got them. Yes.
So, as you were talking,
I've got mics if someone needs them. I'm sure you're eating.
As you were talking about how people don't see themselves in others, and that leads to exploitation. It occurred to me in all the examples that you gave that there's a further step, which is that when you identify with a social group, you justify what you do to other people because it helps your group.
Exactly.
So it's that one step further that what you do because my group is what counts.
Yeah, and I see that especially in political infighting, because to me that's where it tends to get the most insane. It doesn't matter what my party is doing, because the other team is evil. Therefore, anything that my team does requires justification. And everything becomes about confirmation bias. You enter into...
Us first.
Yeah, it's us first, therefore I get my news from us. I don't trust it unless it comes from us, and everything else is fake. And I'm going to question the sincerity and the humanity of the person who disagrees with me. So Dee Dee had her hand up, and then Deborah over here.
Yeah, you gave a grim picture, of how the planet's future. So what do you see? And what are the actions that need to happen? And can they happen quickly?
Regarding the speed, no, I'm a bad person to ask about this. Let me put it this way. It's not like I think the world is ending, okay? But I do see this as a kind of essential moment in which I don't think it's possible for us to completely solve it, where it's as if, the Industrial Revolution never happened. I don't think that's possible, but I think that the world that we can build out of this crisis is much better and much more human than anything that's come before it. I really do believe that. But I think it requires a mixture of both. I think it requires a balance of working on the self while also trying to impact change in the larger world, because no matter what your diet is or whether you go on a plane or not, the impact in climate change tends to happen primarily at national levels. I really think that changes have to happen in government, not just in the individual. But I think that both need to happen. But I think that if you just push for political change without working on the self, it's the same thing what I was talking about before. It's the same worldview that created the problem in the first place. It's just going to lead to more of that, rather than anything new or different. And so I don't want to get too into the weeds about what policies specifically, mainly because that's, I feel like, where maybe people in this room might disagree with me, and it'll turn into a conversation about that. The principle is where I think is the most important in general, and that's where I'm starting. Does that make any sense? Anybody else? Yes, of course, Deborah.
No, actually, it's
Sophia.
the point about you brought up of the perennial source of inspiration,
Yeah.
having to do with helping the climate. Deborah has in second grade. The kids go around and collect recyclables to recycle. And this is a second grade project. They're very proud of it. If you don't have anything for them because you yourself have taken the recyclables to the point where they collect them, they get upset because they take pride. But they come to third grade and I find plastic in the garbage, other recyclables in the garbage. And it's like as if they forgot, of their project or their duty, in a sense, to make it, to help fight climate change or to do something to help the planet. So that it's constant. That I like that perennial source of inspiration. You have to keep on being reminded that this is all the time, every day, and you can make a difference. Each little person can make a difference in their own way. So.
This is why we have them as teachers, the progressives. You want to say something?
So ultimately, it really is too late for any adult. Like, I didn't just, well, you had a big impact on what you just said to me, in a way that you don't know, but I'm sitting here thinking about the world in general, and so it's all through the children. There's like, at this point in time, there's nothing I can get to have my family or other political opponents change. They're just not going to listen. Like, you have to kind of be born with a certain sense of neohumanism inside you. If you're all born in the same family and you all have the same experiences, but one person deviates.
I would say that we are capable of change today. Right now, every single day is a choice, which relates to the perennial source of inspiration. However, I will agree that there's a hardening that takes place at the end of childhood. And I think in general, an adult, to make a real kind of tectonic shift, it's almost like their whole system needs to collapse. Like, there needs to be a dramatic destruction of what's happened in their life so there can be a fertile ground for them to take rebirth in that. With children, the impact is so much more intense, which is why neo-humanist education is important, and which is why P.R. Sarkar always emphasized early child education. The younger the child, the more these ideas can really, germinate, take root. Which isn't to say that we adults are hopeless.
No, I'm thinking about other people.
How about somebody from the back, maybe? Vishmitra.
Yeah, just to follow up on what you just said, it requires a certain amount of change in adults to offer an education to children.
Right. That's an excellent point. That was my exact point. Anybody from the back? Don't be shy. No? Okay.
Maybe it's all about that the earth does not belong to us. We belong to the earth.
That's right. That's my presentation.
And we're an extended family every day. I met 2 new friends today. You got to talk to them.
What's your name?
Ellie.
Well, there's a camera right there. I mean, I couldn't have put it better myself. I've often spent a lot of time even asking the question, what does it mean to belong to the land? How do I practice that? How do I make that real? Because you're exactly right. That is so much closer to the neo-humanist outlook. That it's not that you possess anything, it's that you're possessed by, right? And for those of the people in the room who actually meditate, that's what they call the secret of meditation. It's not so much that you are meditating upon some limitless, infinite part of yourself. It's that you are the object of that infinite, limitless self. And that is meditating on you. That's the secret, right? But I know that not everybody in the room meditates. Anybody else? Okay, well, I just really want to sincerely, humbly thank you from the bottom of my heart for your attention. It's such an honor to be able to share some of this with so many esteemed colleagues. You know, many of the people in this room, I've been going to your workshops for 15 years, and it's really a blessing to be able to present here with all of you in this incredible venue. So, thank you.